The board is back in session after our working lunch. We did have a closed session, and that's item 9A, and direction was given to staff. So moving forward for our timed item, and that is agenda item 5E, discussion and possible action, including direction to staff regarding ordinance amendment number OA 2019-0001, which proposes to amend the Mendocino County Local Coastal Program by adding 2 new chapters to the Coastal Zoning Code regulating 1, coastal cannabis cultivation, and 2, coastal cannabis facilities. Planning and Building Services and County Council are the sponsors, so I'll let staff take it forward from there.
Thank you, Chair Brown. So Julia Acker-Krog, Chief Planner, and I'm just going to introduce, we have Beth Burks here from LACO, who has been working with us on this ordinance, and she's actually going to take us through a brief presentation. We're going to leave lots of time for discussion and getting the direction that we've requested from you today. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Good afternoon. Beth Burks with LACO Associates, and I'll give a brief presentation. As you mentioned, this is the Coastal Cannabis Cultivation Ordinance and Coastal Cannabis Facilities Ordinance. This will be an amendment to the local coastal plan to insert these ordinances. We have tried, by and large, to mimic the inland ordinances for consistency's sake, but as mentioned in the staff report, there are several places we have deviated from that in order to keep it consistent with the coastal zone. I'd like to just highlight a couple things from the staff report so that we can spend most of the time on questions you may have. In relation to the cultivation ordinance, we'll take a look at the zoning table 1. I think it's on page 3 of the ordinance. You'll see that everything in the coastal zone, all different cultivation types require either a coastal development permit or a coastal development use permit. And one thing that's really unique in the coastal zone is that even if it's cultivation for personal use, if there are some type of ancillary facility that goes with that that would constitute development in the coastal zone, that it would still require a coastal development permit. So we've tried to match up, permit types and permit, the difference really is the decision maker. A coastal development permit can be made by the coastal development permit administrator, and then use permits, I believe, go to the Planning Commission. So that's the main difference in the permit types. The findings are fairly identical. We do have one major difference from the inland table, and that has to do with the rural residential parcels. In the coastal zone, we would recommend, and this is something we'd be seeking guidance on eliminating the differences between the different sizes of rural residential. So that was rural residential, for example, 2 acres, 5 acres, 10 acre minimums, and actually making that based rather than on the size specified in the zone, by basing it on the actual parcel size. So, and then also taking into consideration the parcel sizes of parcels surrounding that. So if you were, perhaps rural residential 2 acre minimum, but you actually have 10 acres of land and everyone surrounding you has larger parcel sizes, you would be eligible for a larger cultivation permit. So again, it's just basing it on actual parcel sizes and neighboring sizes versus what the zone would allow. Also, we don't recommend eliminating the dwelling unit requirement on any of the rural residential parcels. We feel that that's important to have the principal use going on the parcel before we allow for a cultivation permit. But that is also something we'd be seeking guidance on. In the coastal zone, we would be treating all permits as new permits, so we don't have a difference in this cultivation ordinance that differentiates between existing cultivators and the process for that versus a different phase of cultivators. Everybody's just going to be considered new. And let's see, there are setback exceptions that can be requested. That's built into the ordinance because every permit essentially requires discretion. That can be something that they request when they apply for their discretionary permit, and there's specific findings to make for that. And then the last thing I want to talk about specific to cultivation is water. And basically, we'd be looking at, just like inland, you can't have any illegal source of water used for your cultivation site, but we would be looking to have this be consistent with what's already in place in the coastal zone, which is the Mendocino County Coastal Groundwater Guidelines. So that's typical of every coastal permit, and it would be typical of these cultivation permits as well. So just real quick, is there anything you guys want to add to cultivation? Okay. Then we'll switch over to facilities. Just a quick recap.
Could we go into the cultivation
or do you want to
before? Or do you want to do
Do you want to do
facilities and
cultivation?
then go back?
Sure.
Well, we can.
I just think why it was fresh in everybody's mind what you just said.
Sounds great.
Okay.
So distinguishing the difference between this proposed ordinance for the coastal zone versus what was adopted for the inland portion of Mendocino County. So what was adopted for inland Mendocino County is that in the rural residential 2-acre zone, cultivation would be sunsetted out. So just a year from now at this point, it was 3 years out, but we're less than a year away at this point, it would be sunsetted out of the R2 neighborhoods. And it wasn't, there were no new applicants allowed. The only area of the Mendocino coast, using that term loosely, not necessarily associating with the coastal zone, where the R2 neighborhood, where an R2 neighborhood was considered for an overlay, which was outside of Fort Bragg, it was opposed, 8 to 1. I mean, it was overwhelmingly rejected by the neighbors to allow new cultivation in that neighborhood or the continuation. So given that feedback that we've had from the one neighborhood on the coast that has been given the chance to weigh in, I really think it'd be folly for the county to allow new cultivation sites, let alone existing cultivation sites, under a new ordinance in the coastal zone in the 2-acre zoning district. So I think it would be a mistake to include that in here. And then on the R5, if I read it correctly, it says 5 acres, but then it allows for as little as 3.5 acres. So it's really 3.5 acres becomes the new minimum for 5. And also in contrast to our inland code, the inland code only allows existing cultivators to continue in the R5 neighborhood, does not allow new cultivation sites in the R5. Until perhaps in 2020 when new applications are allowed. But I think even in 2020, I think it's not allowed in the R5 neighborhood inland. So why would we allow new applicants, new cultivation sites in the coastal zone on 5-acre parcels, or actually on 3.5 acres? So those are questions that I have about why we're looking at greater intensity, because what I see is greater blowback from neighbors who's saying, well, why are you allowing more intensity in the coastal zone given the feedback you've received so far in the smaller zoned, in the residential neighborhoods on the coast to date. So I'm kind of questioning that.
If I may, through the chair, Jesse Davis, Planning and Building Services Senior Planner. One of the things that we were trying to address, particularly with the zoning designations for rural residential, are the inconsistencies that we see across the county. Unfortunately, on the inland side, we have a lot of RR1 parcels that, quite frankly, have more than the conforming amount of 1 acre. They have oftentimes 10 acres, 20 acres. As a result, one of the things that we're trying to address, and we felt more comfortable addressing in the coastal zone, was facilitating the removal of the discretion between RR1, RR5, RR10, et cetera, in part because we now have the CDP as the process into which to review that application. So one aspect we were trying to address is the inconsistency of zoning. The other is that we felt more comfortable with the discretionary permit type to facilitate the review of these new cultivation sites in the coastal zone. I'll let other staff address other aspects of it as well.
And I will just echo what Jesse said, and Julia Ackerkrog, excuse me, for the record. So really what we intended here was not necessarily to make it more permissible, but to look at some of the issues that we've had with our inland ordinance and issues where when you have it restricted down to RR2, RR5 as being the zoning type that you have to be in, even if you're a 10-acre site, you're still hamstringed by having that zoning designation of RR5 or whatever that may be. So taking out the differences between looking at RR2, RR5, RR10, and really making it acreage based as opposed to looking at just the zoning designation in and of itself. And also just echoing what Mr. Davis said, is that in the coastal zone, you get very site-by-site specific review. So when you're going through these coastal development permits and use permit processes, it's a discretionary process. Your neighbors are given the opportunity to come be involved in that process, attend a public hearing, provide public comment, unlike many areas of our inland county where you are only doing a ministerial action, which means that it's pretty much done in-house with very minimal public input as well.
Supervisor Jurdy.
Well, so I understand what you're saying about the issue with the inland code, but I think if we were to be consistent with the feedback we've received on our land use code that we adopted inland, we would not want to allow it to be a coastal development permit to be allowed unless there was, I think, at least a minimum of 5 acres at play. I think going down to 2 acres, going down to 3.5 acres is just inviting a bunch of angst and complaints from neighbors and who are saying, didn't you get the message last time when a neighborhood on the coast was asked to weigh in on this, when the reaction was overwhelmingly opposed to it? Now you're ignoring that in the coastal zone. You're now allowing on 2 acre, on 3.5 acre parcels. What are you guys thinking? So I just think that we need to pay attention to what people have told us. We've already learned, hopefully, some lessons from that, and we aren't. I think it'd be a mistake to go down anywhere below 5 acres.
Supervisor Williams.
I don't see that the requirement should be the acreage as much as whether it's in a neighborhood. I think you could have 10 acres. If it's in a neighborhood on a private road, there'd still be objection. Whereas you could have 3.5 acres surrounded by large ag or rangeland parcels without any complaints. And so I appreciate that we're trying to take what we've learned, the lessons learned from the inland ordinance and rectify those problems for coastal. But I wonder if there's a way we could further get at the concept of a neighborhood, a residential neighborhood versus a parcel along state highway, surrounded by not other residences, but open space.
If I may, through the chair, before I respond, Jesse Davis, senior planner. Another aspect of the coastal zone that we do suspect is that the primary type of cultivation will not be outdoors or mixed light, as it is primarily throughout the inland portion of our county. We do expect to have the primary form of cultivation be indoor cultivation, and so we were trying to balance this sort of reality with, indoor cultivation not requiring the number of acres that would be corresponding to an outdoor or mixed light facility site. So that was another consideration that we took into play.
So understood. In Mitchell Creek, it was all indoors.
Right.
Did not make a difference. Neighbors didn't want it. Did not want it. And
And-
so their issue was water on small parcels close to each other.
And-
so indoors apparently has no effect on eliminating neighborhood opposition.
Supervisor Williams.
Are there any ways we can get at the real issues rather than have neighbors upset about potential water or potential smell? Can we make sure that the ordinance does prohibit the smell from crossing the property line? Because I think that's a real issue, right? It's a balancing property, right? Somebody who doesn't smell cannabis today doesn't want to smell it tomorrow. And likewise with the water, is there a way to set a cap? Someone doing aquaponics with 98% water reuse isn't really draining the water table for their neighborhood. Someone doing 2,500 square feet and not conserving water could cause an issue. How do we incorporate that into the ordinance, a reasonable water use?
So thank you, Julia Acker-Krog, Chief Planner. So certainly on the water use aspect, we have the Coastal Groundwater Study and Coastal Groundwater Development Guidelines that is unlike inland. That study was done in the 1980s in the coastal zone, and there's guidelines established. So there's different proof of water or hydrological study requirements depending on how much water you're using at a particular site. So in crafting this ordinance, the section of code that's referenced in here, 20.516, that really relates to and really mirrors the development guidelines from the groundwater guidelines. And it speaks to if you're a major water user, which is over 1,500 gallons per day, that you're typically required to do a hydro study to demonstrate that you're not impacting adjacent properties as you draw down from your well. On sites that are considered minor water users, which would be less than 1,500 gallons per day, they would very likely just be required to do proof of water at most. And now, of course, there's, as you'll see, there's flexibilities written in, and this was detailed a little bit in the staff memo as well, where environmental health can approve other either not requiring a study or approving, a more minimal study depending on the circumstances of a site. So where a site might already be developed, have intensive development on it, they may not be required to do as much water proving. And now for your other issues, I heard smell in there, and could you just elaborate what were the other issues?
Smell and water.
Smell and water, okay. And
And I would add traffic, I've heard, is a concern.
Yes, and for traffic and such on a coastal development permit level, we are looking at there's certain findings that have to be made for every coastal development permit, and one is that there's adequate access roads and utilities that serve the site. So a component of that would be looking at it on a site-by-site specific review, and also gives neighbors the opportunity to come and have input at whatever public hearing. If it's a coastal development permit, that's going to be the coastal permit administrator hearings, or it might be on consent calendar here at the Board of Supervisors. And then with a use permit would be the Planning Commission. So there is the opportunity for neighborhoods that have those sorts of issues to get more involved in the process than what we currently have for our inland side of the county.
Thank you.
Supervisor McCowan?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So if I understand correctly, I think staff's position is that where you're requiring a coastal development permit or a coastal development use permit, you'll be able to examine every one of the neighborhood concerns, whether it's traffic, odor, water consumption, whatever, and in a publicly noticed public forum.
That is correct.
Thank you.
Okay. We'll move forward to the next ordinance, please.
Oh, before we leave that one, I'm sorry, Madam Chair, if I may.
Yes.
So I posed a few questions to staff this morning, and one, just looking at the table, I don't see any of the Walala zoning, I don't see commercial, I don't see industrial. So
I can speak to that, Julia Acker-Krog. So thank you for your email this morning too. We were able to review that, and really it will make more sense, I think, as you see the facilities code, because within the coastal zone area of Mendocino County, there's very limited industrial and commercially zoned properties, and as such, we really wanted to preserve those for things under the facilities ordinance that would really require being located in those districts, maybe because of the volatile solvents or whatever is used in those processes. So it was a decision that we made at the staff level, and of course we're here today for direction on that as well. We really made the decision to keep the limited amount of zoned parcels for industrial and commercial available for facilities, and having cultivation occur within other zoning districts than those. So.
thank you. Although it may indicate we need to look at rezoning more parcels, but another discussion.
At
And
a
then,
later date.
if I may, through the chair, I did want to respond to the question with regards to how to address the neighborhood concerns ultimately. And I do think that the most appropriate venue to sort of address those concerns would be through the minimum parcel size ultimately. Ultimately, the neighborhoods that we're discussing typically feature smaller acreages. So, ultimately, whether it's a 3 or 4 acre cap, I do think that that would be sort of a useful way to begin to break out in a simplified manner sort of the neighborhood areas that we want to sort of set aside. Thank you.
Okay. Let's move to facilities.
Thank you. Beth Burks, for the record. Okay, so with the facilities code, we can start by looking at table 1 in that ordinance. And you'll see that far more limited, areas that we would allow the different types of facilities. Processing and distribution kind of have the widest range, looking at being able to do that, including in agricultural areas. There are a couple of items, if you're retail and dispensary and you're going into an existing facility and you would not be intensifying the use, so if it's already a storefront and it's been used commercially, that is the one exception where you could actually do something without a coastal development permit, because that structure would already be there and we wouldn't be doing anything that was meeting the criteria of development in the coastal zone. But if you are going into a facility and you need major renovations, you're doing an addition or even maybe major parking lot improvements, all of that would meet the definition of development, and that would still require a coastal permit. So this is just specific to the fact that if you're not doing any other development, that retail in commercial commercial zones in both the town of Guala and then coastwide would only be a zoning clearance. Everything else, as you know, again, a coastal development permit or a coastal development use permit, we've tried to match the uses that are already allowed in these particular zoning districts. So we've stayed very consistent with you know, if you know, for example, manufacturing is allowed in industrial, we've allowed it there. We haven't deviated at all from what the base uses are, or the principal uses are in the existing coastal zone. One thing we would like to get some guidance on, we did add a chapter in facilities that's much different than the inland code. We've added cannabis events. I think that your planning staff gets a lot of questions about how to do events, and we wanted to provide a pathway for that. All events would need a coastal permit, and it references back to the event section of the regular coastal code. So the permit path would be the same. There are a couple of additional findings for a cannabis event that are outlined in the staff report that are pretty basic, just that you have to be licensed with the state primarily, and that the event venue also be permitted. So that's I think all I really need to say about the facilities is just rather take some questions before we get into other details.
And we already have someone that wants to do that. Supervisor Haschek.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, talking about cannabis events, and I got some communication, and I was told that this was the time to bring it up. It's not the time to bring it up. It would be better to bring it up during my report.
Okay.
Is that what I'm hearing? Okay.
Supervisor Jurdy.
So I was looking at table 1 on facilities, and I'm looking at the ag lands, and there are actually some agricultural parcels in the coastal zone. I would say there's more agricultural land in the coastal zone than there is industrial. And I'm thinking of you know, the comparison we often hear about cannabis being kind of the new vineyards, the new wineries, the new wine of Mendocino County in the open market. And I think of wineries, they're on vineyards. Vineyards are on land zoned ag land, and there's a vineyard, and then there's, in most cases, a vineyard also has a winery where they're interacting and selling their product directly to the customers. Why aren't we looking at it the same way for cannabis? If we're under this chart, it only shows processing and distribution being allowed, but why not allow manufacturing? Why not allow testing? Why not allow retail and micro business on ag land, so long as it's only a small portion of the property, so long as, I don't know, 90% of the property is still remained in active ag use? There must be some general standards that we have for wineries and for vineyards. Couldn't we just apply that to cannabis? Or if they don't exist in writing, why don't we just sort of look at what's actually happening on the ground with the wineries and the vineyards and saying, okay, 10% of your land, 15% of your land, whatever, in these other uses is a reasonable amount to accommodate these other uses. The rest must remain in active agriculture.
Julia Ackerkrog. So with the ag zoning, we really tried to tie these to analogous uses. So we were having, at least how it's presently written, without going through like a cottage industry type of permit, it would be more challenging for us to tie it to analogous uses for those various types. But that's certainly something that we can receive direction from you guys today if you'd like to add more of those areas, more different types of facilities to be allowed within that zoning district. And I will say, for on the wineries front, we do have in the inland side, we don't have very many wineries in the coastal zone, as you can understand. There's just some climate challenges with that. But we have a limit that the tasting rooms can only be 25% of the total winery area. So that's the limit that we have on the inland side, just for the benefit of the board here.
All right. Supervisor McCowan, and I'm going to go to the public.
I did have one more question, maybe a couple. So one of them with regard to section 20.537050 in the cultivation ordinance, we're imposing a setback from an access easement. The board's had this discussion several times. My recollection, every single time the board has thought that it was unreasonable to have a setback from an access easement on an owner's own property where someone else has acquired an access easement across that property, why should the underlying owner of the parcel have to have a setback from the easement on their own property? So I think that's unreasonable. Again, I think the board's given direction previously that we agree it's unreasonable, and we're still dealing with it. And that's something maybe you can come back to later or now. The other one I would throw out on definition of legal parcel, we don't have.
Page? Do you have a page? Do you have a page for that definition?
Yeah, the definition of legal parcel, which is in the beginning of the cultivation ordinance.
Right.
It's probably going to. Which one? It's on page 1.
Okay.
I think. Wait. Oh, no, I'm sorry, it appears, I'm confusing myself.
1 of 13 at the bottom.
1 of 13, it is there. So anyway, that definition of legal parcel no longer contains language referring to when the parcel was created or when a certificate of compliance was recorded. So that would seem to allow people to come in and subdivide for the purpose of allowing cannabis cultivation. That's different from the inland ordinance.
Thank you.
So at some point, we could get the explanation.
You can go forward.
Sure. So Julia Acker-Krog, and I'll just respond to your second part there first. So really, well, actually, so with the legal parcel, essentially, we are right now not looking at limiting it as to when the parcel is created. Unlike in the inland areas, we had where we were really trying to permit existing cultivators, and essentially where we're starting in the coastal zone is at kind of a blank slate. Everyone's treated equally underneath the ordinance. So with that in mind, we did not feel that it was appropriate that we needed to maintain that 2016 date. But again, this is, we're here for direction today, and if that's something that the board is interested in seeing us have a limitation to prevent future subdivision, that's certainly something we can, look into adding into the ordinance. And then for your first part about the access easements, that is one of our board priorities and directives, and we have been actively working on that, and we hope to be back in the very near future here for a discussion and possible action in front of the board.
Well, I don't know why we'd build it into one we're just creating now. So.
Point taken. Thank you.
All righty. We're going to go to public comment. Kim Della Corva. Here they come.
Kim Della Corva, One for the Ranch, Redwood Valley. This one I wrote notes so I could stay focused, not be emotional. So after a short break and pondering the current state of affairs again, I have some new thoughts on the big picture again. As a designer, I've worked in an industry for over 40 years that basically my job and expertise was to figure out how to solve problems and make people's dreams or ideas a reality. It has been super fun for me, and I've been really good at it. The very first question I ever ask my clients is, what do you want? What are your goals? And what are your dreams? Admittedly, this was the entertainment industry, so everything was pretty much based on a fantasy. But I'm here today, now wondering how I can keep my neighbors in business.
It's okay, Kim. It's okay.
I was responsible for convincing many of my neighbors to become compliant, and they've spent a lot of money, and now they're broke and going out of business. So I have some guilt today. But anyway, I'm here wondering how I can help in this predicament. It reminds me of the whirlpool of action on climate change, or push me, pull you, of disparate motivations. What do the economic development projections foresee? Do we have a functional county economic development committee? This is complicated by the fact that our beloved plant has become a whole new giant potential economy, not just for this county, but for the state and our country. The international market is going to happen. What an amazing opportunity for Mendocino to develop. Well, we have this moment again. I assume that we all want to make our community happy and work together for shared goals and dreams. So could the Board of Supervisors please candidly clarify their ultimate vision for the industry, our community, our resulting economy in the long term? I'll try to speed this up. Maybe our cannabis community can help, maybe we can adapt, maybe we can change even what we do for a living. I'm not sure. I wanted to mention one thing that happened in Potter Valley last year is with the grape growers, getting their contracts canceled, and by the company that did it. Constellation Incorporated, Constellation Ventures was the one that canceled those contracts, and they've since invested $6 billion in the cannabis industry in Canopy Fund. I'm not sure if you guys are aware of that, but that industry, it's full of Canadians, Chinese, and all kinds of investors, and the people in that group will not leave their money here. Those profits that the giant corporations make will go out of our community. All these big, can I have an extra few second? I'll try to make it quick. So those monies will not stay here. They're going to go, and they're going to go to where the investors go. And one of the things that's happening right now with the big distributors and big groups is that they're underselling on purpose, and they've lowered the price. It's not just a glut of a product. They're selling the product at a loss to put us out of business. So I hope that the goal of the county supervisors is to work with us and help us be what you want us to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. Karen Byers?
Hello, Karen Byers, 3rd District. So I'm here today because ever since last October, I've been meeting with different members of the Building and Planning, started out with Mary and Vandy. They've gone through many others, and as well as attending the working groups for non-cultivation license types. And my focus has been in particular on allowing events to happen in Mendocino County so that we can really have an exciting cannabis season this year and, move forward in that direction. I think it's going to be one of the more promising aspects of economic development for our county. So as things moved along, I was explained that, and we just wanted to keep it simple. We followed the rule, if the state already requires it, the county shouldn't. So I'm really psyched to see the recommended language in the coastal events. I think that that's exactly what needs to happen. And then but it needs to move faster. So I'm wanting to ask the Board of Supervisors to not only find a way to move the coastal events ordinance through, but to then also bring that into the inland regulations just as soon as possible. I have the opportunity to reestablish the cannabis space at the Kate Wolf Music Festival, something that went on successfully for years under SB 420, and then last year was not allowed to happen because their venue was not approved on a state level. So now we have that opportunity. So it's my understanding that really all I need from the county is a letter of authorization for the venue, not for the event. The state gives the approval on the event. And so that I can move forward in applying in order to meet the states, the way they have it written out. In order to apply for a temporary events permit, I have to do it 60 days before the first day of the event, which basically is Friday. At that point, I need to open up my application. There can be deficiencies, but it'd be great if I can explain to them the path that we've outlined on how to get local approval in there. And in my work with Vandy, basically said that, that somehow we need to get this amended into the inland regulations for this particular event that's inland, and that that I'd have to have an event permit, which the Black Oak Ranch does. So we just talked to them about just writing that into the pre-existing permit, them being building and planning. And then meet all of the other state requirements, which, you know, we can do. And we'll be excited to do to help set that precedence. But so today I'm here to ask that not only do you move the coastal events forwards, that we find a path to move the events forward for inland, the inland ordinance. And I appreciate your time. I'm excited to see what happens.
Thank you. Jude Tillman?
Jude Tillman, the executive of Mendocino Cannabis Alliance. I wasn't going to do this either, but an old friend of mine met with me a week and a half ago. She's been making the best arthritis medicine just outside of Laytonville on her land. Beautiful, pristine stainless steel equipment. She can't afford to stay here because of all the fees and the water board and this, that, the other thing. She's bought land in Colorado. And if you don't understand how the economics of turning this county over to the big players are going to work, not only will it destroy Mendocino culture and our small farmers and entrepreneurs, but it'll take the money away. So you must know that. You must know that. So I'm going to start with reading from the memo on page 5, environmental recommendation regarding CEQA. The preparation, approval, and certification of a local coastal program is exempt from the requirements for preparation of an environmental impact report because the Secretary of Resources has found that the California Coastal Commission's review and approval process is the functional equivalent of the environmental impact report process required by CEQA. CEQA, if this is true, therefore additional uses subject to this analysis would be no burden on the county, a way to allow additional uses as a CEQA-like review via a coastal use permit after it passes the Coastal Commission. Got to think outside the box here. We know we don't have enough industrial land. We know we don't have enough. We've got to approve for non-volatile use of commercial zones. We've got to be a little bit looser here. We've got to. So beyond saving our family farms, which is, of course, the lead domino effect for all the rest of us, to distribution, dispensaries, everybody, we need permit level 1, non-volatile manufacturing activities in coastal commercial zones. We got auto body shops, hair salons, and other businesses that produce worse odors and more toxic fumes than anything you'll ever find in these little benign processes. We need shared facilities. Number 2, fast-tracking permitting of shared facilities. We need distribution, create practical expanded permit process for independent distribution operations in commercial zones. Processing activities that do not need to be tied to cultivation. They're limit them to trimming and packaging, include, as the state has recently done, 2 distribution licenses. Loosen the restrictive language concerning microbusinesses in commercial zones. What is the rationale of tying all allowed microbusiness activities to retail as a primary use? What is that about? And then kudos, thank you for the green light on cannabis events. We're into tourist season now, so we need to move very, very quickly. We need to figure out a way, because it's not enough to just allow volatile. We need the non-volatile in commercial. We don't have the zoning that we need to keep our businesses alive. So please think outside the box. Thank you for listening.
Okay, and hang on to Supervisor Williams.
Not for the speaker, but
okay.
for if I may, I'd like to get staff's feedback on those recommendations of the non-volatile and commercial. Is that something we could consider?
I would point to the table on page 14 of the Cannabis Facilities Ordinance, which does allow non-volatile in commercial subject to a coastal development permit.
Yeah, so I apologize to the speaker, but if you could clarify the request, because I'm hearing staffs articulate that it's already in the draft.
To have
Non-volatile and commercial.
standalone licensing?
Yes,
That I retract my
bravo.
victory. One little tiny Thank you so much.
Yeah, that was good. Okay, I'm sorry. Hannah Nielsen.
Hannah Nelson. I normally, when we start doing ordinances, I write detailed memos and I go line by line. And I felt like people weren't really reading them. It wasn't really effective, so I stopped. Now I feel like, oh, geez, there are so many specific points that I want to make, and we only have 3 minutes, which is a little bit insane, and I understand because there's a lot to go through. So I probably will try and submit a memo after this fact, and I'm sorry, I really thought that it was better to not. But I will go line by line in that memo, so I hope that those items would be considered. But just in general, I think we have an opportunity here by having to utilize the coastal development permit and coastal development use permit process, which automatically exempts us from traditional CEQA because it's akin to site-specific review. We've got an opportunity to not be afraid of, we can't change this kind of use or this kind of zoning because it would require a whole big environmental analysis. And so I just ask that we really look at the details of this with that in mind. This is going to be very burdensome for applicants, so we might as well expand the possibilities that are allowable under the onerous conditions that are required because of the Coastal Commission. The other thing that I would ask you to really look at some of the specific requirements and whether they really is a good reason for it. So for example, here's a little tiny example in a facilities ordinance where a processor that has a retail place or that's processing at a retail place can only have 25% of its floor space. But under state law, you can't have processing accessed by the public anyway. So what was the purpose of that condition? And if we could, once again, just take a step back and look at some of the reasons behind some of these issues and ask why. There are quite a few areas where I think that the analysis forgot to include things like micro businesses and the difference of how they operated, so I had asked to review it with that lens. And also, there are, it seems like, duplicative things from the state. If we're going to require people to adhere to CDFW requirements and the water board requirements, which we should, then why are we also making them detail each of those things rather than just detailing compliance with those state agencies? And just lastly, there's a few places where there's contiguous parcel requirements. 2 seconds, I only have.
Come on.
Okay, so contiguous, the word contiguous is used a lot, and I just ask you to review that and see whether it's really necessary. And also 2 permits per person rather than 1, just like the inland. Thank you.
Thanks.
If I may, through the chair, I feel that I need to clarify on the CEQA component.
Okay, sure.
If you don't mind, thank you. So for a local coastal program amendment, yes, that the process through going with the Coastal Commission is found to be the functional equivalent. What's required on each of these coastal development permits or coastal development use permits is going to be site-by-site specific CEQA documentation. So some may be able to be found to be exempt, some may require doing an initial study, and then likely adoption of a negative declaration or mitigated negative declaration. But just to clarify that the exemption that's referenced in the packet here solely applies to the ordinance itself and does not apply to the individual permits that would be processed, but that we have built into our process that's part of the fee that you pay, that staff conducts a site-by-site specific review under CEQA, and we may be able to find things to be categorically exempt, statutorily exempt, but very likely we'd be doing initial studies and possibly a negative declaration or mitigated neg dec.
Okay, thank you. Casey?
Good afternoon, Casey O'Neill, local farmer, policy chair for Mendocino Cannabis Alliance. Definitely would like to echo strong support for fast-tracking event language. You know, there's a bit of a frustrating thing in which legalization has meant that we don't get to do events anymore. Up until the passage of regulations, we were able to do farmers markets at Area 101, and it was, you know, from a personal perspective, I built my business model as a farmers market farmer on the ability to interact with customers and to get some of that retail dollar. And given the reality of cannabis regulations right now, I don't have the ability to do direct sales. once we can get to events, and the key there is that I have to have a retail license in order to do direct sales. If we have events, farmers can at the very least partner with a retailer, or for instance, a cooperative could have a retail license and the farmers could vend in that manner. So there still remains a potential to get to that point once we have the events operating. And I have participated in you know, obviously festivals at Black Oak Ranch since I was a little kid, but cannabis event, or the cannabis event space there during past festivals, and it was great. It was really a cool thing, and so I definitely want to offer strong support for that. Very glad to see that the coastal regs are happening. It's been a journey to get to that point. And then also wanted to just let the board know that Assembly Bill 286, the tax reduction bill, did pass out of committee this morning with a 17-0 vote, so great success there. And then also Assembly Bill 858, which is the legislation would change the 25 plants for outdoor cultivation at the state level to allow for 2,500 square foot. So that's also something we're very excited about. That passed out of committee as well. Thank you.
And thank you for the update, Casey. Bob Barsotti?
Hi, I'm Bob Barsotti, one of the owners of Black Oak Ranch and the producer of the festivals up in Laytonville. We've been doing this for 28 years now, and another decade before that, we began our summer camp facility up there with Camp Wind Rainbow and the Women's Herbal Symposium. So close to 4 decades we've been operating in the northern part of our county with a lot of success bringing in tourists. We've brought in close to 1 million people over these 40 years into our little town of Laytonville. And I don't know of any other thing in Laytonville that's ever done that before. And, you know, when the medical marijuana came into approval by the state, I approached our sheriff about the idea of having a booth at our festival. He was very kind to bring the DA into the discussion, and we went through all the various things that we'd have to do and basically came up with a plan to allow that to happen at our shows. And he had a series of requirements, which was a fenced area, security, you couldn't see in from the outside, that sort of thing. These are all the same regulations that the state's now saying that events have to have. So we've already been complying with all of the things that the state currently asks for. And right now, the state, in order to get this state license for our event, I'm working with Karen Byers, because to get an event permit for one event a year costs $7,000. Well, when I was doing our medical marijuana area with 6 booths in it, I was making $6,000 a year. So it would make it so I'd make 0 if I had to go out and get the permit myself. So I've teamed up with Karen, who's getting a permit to operate events, and one of the events will be at my facility. And I'm really looking for some help from the supervisors to allow this to happen. And it seems like the state really needs just an approval from the county of Mendocino saying that this is an approved site. And I don't know what has to happen to make that all happen, but boy, I sure would appreciate it if we could make it happen, because last year we didn't have it, and it was the first year that marijuana was legal in our state. So it just seems kind of backwards, and I'd really appreciate whatever you guys could do to help fast track this and make it so this year at Kate Wolf, people can come and enjoy a little legal cannabis while they're listening to the music and enjoying the sun of Mendocino County. Thank you.
Okay. Supervisor Judy?
Did we switch agenda items? I thought we were talking about the coastal plan. So I think your comments are heard, and it needs to be addressed on a separate agenda item, but we're right now talking about amending the coastal plan, and Laytonville is definitely not in the coastal zone.
Okay. So, any more public comment? Seeing no one come forward, it's back to... Yes, sir. Please come forward, state your name for the record, and know you have 3 minutes.
Hi, my name is Tetsu Mishev. I have property on this county, and I'm retirement in...
Okay. Sir?
Say again?
Could you please give your name again, spell your last name, please?
Mishev, M-I-S-H-E-V.
M-I-H-U-V.
M-I-S-H-E-V, Mishev, Mr. Mishev.
M-I-T-C...
M-I-S-H-E-V.
S-H-E-V.
He's got it. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
I'm partner with 3 people, retirement, spent all my money. I like Mendocino County, buy property with 3 people. And we was with medical marijuana before 7-8 years. All around the county almost was broke. After you give little bit break on people, this county around Mendocino and all this county, Campbell County, start losing. Now when I pass through Daisy, only 1 car last year, and before that was hundreds of cars. Everything was life, everything was willing to do something. I don't know, whatever they do to make great America again, I'm definitely for this one. I'm happy I escaped during the communist apartheid. I have 2 daughters, they are doctors. Now I enjoy my retirement. But guys, whatever you do, you destroy small businesses and everybody. And your county and everything store gonna be broke again with this regulation. And they make this one, I don't know how you guys make it, but you make difficult for people to survive. That's all. My English is not perfect, but
You are fine, sir.
yeah, whatever. This is not right. A lot of people are not agree with this one. I'm also not agree with this one because I'm working more than 30 years, pay my taxes, I pay taxes for my property, and when we have to enjoy our retirement, you do not allow us to join our retirement and to do something. I'm here to ask what, I don't know what to do, to sell the property or what to do on whatever regulation. I would like to go with the law. I don't like to break the law. That's all I can say. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Before 10 years, all around the property and county was for sale. They was broke. Now after they blows on everything, you guys destroy, ladies and gentlemen, you destroy everything. Big guys want to buy everything, you know. Even lost cost land and forest. They pretend for 30 feet and they burn one of my building because in my property 12 by 12 sequoia, the biggest historical sequoia. And now they move the border and took my land. I told them that we have to see the judge. I would like to go with the law. Was all around the sheriff, and I was with fire department, guys who is responsible for the things, and he told me that he cannot do nothing. If I burning something, they gonna
Sir,
give me.
your time is up.
They're gonna give me 25 to life, but for the big guys, it's nothing. It's not fair. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I'm not fluent with English, but the things is not so right.
Thank you, sir. Okay, any more public comment? Please come forward. Seeing no one, it's back to the board. Staff, did you have any comment or response to any of the speakers?
Not at this time.
Okay. Supervisor Williams?
What's the best method for staff to receive the input? I think the 3 minutes with staff trying to copy down as fast as they can probably isn't the most efficient. And I think sending it to a supervisor and having a supervisor pass it to staff isn't ideal either. Is there an inbox for requests, recommendations regarding this draft so that we can coalesce all that input into one place and let staff have a chance to attempt to apply it?
Okay, it appears I've got 2 supervisors that want to speak to that.
No, not to that.
Supervisor McCowan, of what Supervisor Williams said.
So unfortunately, it looks like we're not ready to introduce. Is that right? You're just looking for direction?
No, that's later. It wouldn't be introducing today.
Yeah, well, I think that's unfortunate, given we've only been waiting 3 years.
Julia Acker-Krog, if I may, we would first need to go through Planning Commission. So depending on the direction that we receive here today, we're ready to hit the ground running with that. But it really depends on what this board, if there's any revisions or any changes to the ordinance you wish to see. We wanted to make sure that we got an opportunity to get in front of you, get your initial takes on the ordinance before we took it too far. This also helps to reduce time once we hit those Planning Commission hearings.
So therefore, staff's answer to Supervisor Williams' question would be, I mean, typically, we would have a discussion and what three or more say. There may be minor points that can be suggested to staff that, in their judgment, they could incorporate. What is the best way to proceed?
Deputy County Counsel Matthew Kudrowski, I think if there are major points of discussion, we outlined some in the staff report that was presented to the board, we would look to the board to give direction on those. It isn't wordsmithing today. We can do that as we go forward, but any kind of direction on issues with zoning, things we've heard on a broad level, we would look to the board for a direction of three or more.
Supervisor Williams?
Yeah, so I would like to get Jude's recommendations, that list she read off. I agreed with everything I heard, and I'd like to give that to staff to see if we can incorporate those changes. And then I would like to know when this will come to the Planning Commission. Do we have a target date?
And Supervisor Williams, point of order.
I'm sorry.
You have to have agreement, as Supervisor McCowan stated, of at least 2 other supervisors.
For me to collect the input and pass it to staff? Then
to give direction to staff. So it may be that we need to get a list of that and maybe go over it. But unless you have at least 2 colleagues that agree with you, it would not go forward.
can I find 2 colleagues to agree to funnel all of the public comments, coalesce them into a single document and hand them to staff for an attempt to incorporate?
We may hear that. Hang on. From down this side.
I think some of us would appreciate seeing that in writing. I mean, we also heard that staff said that at least one of her items was already incorporated into the ordinance, so I'm not clear what it is that she requested that isn't already in the ordinance.
Supervisor Hescheck?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to hear that list again because I wrote down a couple of the things, but I didn't. Okay.
It's online.
It's online. Yeah. Yeah, if you refresh it.
Okay.
Supervisor, I'm going to go to Supervisor McCowan so you can have a moment to look at that, the correspondence.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I was going to point out that the correspondence is online, so we can go through that point by point at the appropriate time. So I would like to see if the board is willing to strike the language regarding an access easement on page 4. It's under 050, Section A, Section 4. At the end of that sentence, it says, or access easement, whichever is most restrictive. And I think it's consistent with previous board direction. If we do strike that, it's creating a setback on an owner's property from an easement that serves their neighbors.
Second.
Well, it's not a motion, but we're trying to get a straw vote here. So does anyone else agree to strike?
Well, I'll tell you what, I'm having problems with my iPad.
Oh, it's page.
And I wasn't concentrating on.
Page 4.
It's showing I have no attachments at this point.
I had the same trouble.
What? I'm trying to get back. Yeah, you're in the wrong spot. You need to be right. Oh, gotcha. Thank you. Okay, so which document, sir?
The draft ordinance for the page
Cultivation.
4 of 13. Item A4 in the middle of the page.
Are you in the cultivation ordinance?
Yes.
Yeah.
And it would be under section 20.537.050. Restate your question.
I'm suggesting we strike or access easement, whichever is most restrictive. So just put a period after ownership.
Which number is it?
A4, it's 20.537.050.
Yeah.
A4.
So Supervisor Haschek, it wouldn't say or access easement, whichever is more restrictive. There'd be a period right after ownership. Supervisor Williams,
Agreed.
Supervisor Haschek.
Agree.
Okay. Supervisor Jurdy.
I'll reserve judgment.
If I may, through the chair,
Yes.
we're talking about the specific request about the access easement. Really, with the deletion of access easement, staff doesn't see a major concern with that, acknowledging, of course, that any facility or any cultivation site would need to still meet parcel setbacks and or a corridor preservation setback if applicable to that particular site.
Fine.
So just wanted to chime in there with that.
Okay. Supervisor McCowan.
Well understood as to a building setback, but the corridor preservation, we've previously given direction, and ideally staff is working on an update to corridor preservation countywide, not just for cannabis.
Correct, we are. It's on
Right.
our board priorities and
But
directives.
there's,
Yes.
you don't foresee any problem with striking this language today.
I do not see a problem with striking the language as it's written today from this.
Right, thank you.
And I believe there are 3 supervisors at least that agree. So take it as direction to staff. Oh, you weren't through? Okay. Supervisor McCowan?
One more, if I may. I raised earlier the question regarding definition of legal parcel on page 1 of 13.
Oh, yeah.
And whereas the inland ordinance has language that would not allow cultivation on parcels created after a certain date, or which certificates of compliance were recorded after a certain date, we don't have that here. And the intent of that language wasn't to benefit legacy cultivators. It wasn't meant to only apply for phase 1. It was meant to apply for phase 1, 2, 3, except for industrial. But for resource lands, the intent was to disincentivize subdividing resource lands in order to allow cultivation. So, you know, the intent is try to keep resource lands for their original purpose, but allow cultivation on existing parcels if they meet all the other requirements, but not allow a rangeland or forest land parcel to be broken up to accommodate cannabis. That was the intent.
And under the, no, hang on. So, under, like it would with certificate of compliance, what do you,
Well, yeah, and so the...
so I'm asking for new language because we're not.
Well, this is in draft form. I think if we give direction, staff can go to the inland ordinance, and they would incorporate the same language that disallows creation of new parcels by subdivision for the purpose of cultivating cannabis. So it would plug in the existing date in the inland ordinance from 2016, that if a parcel was created after that date by subdivision or by recordation of a certificate of compliance, that would not allow them to grow cannabis
Okay, and I think I could agree
on
with
the
that.
new parcel.
I remember us having quite a discussion about that. And
I support that.
And I do remember from other agenda items that in Albion, for instance, they called it postage stamp sizes with certificates of compliance. So I support what you're proposing. Supervisor Williams?
Could I get clarification on the date? After what date?
I think it may be 1/1/16.
That is correct.
So I believe that has at least three supervisors nodding their heads. Okay. Supervisor Jurdy?
So I have one issue I want to go back to on facilities and then one on cultivation. So on the facilities, back to the chart of uses, given the fact that people will have to apply for a coastal development permit, and I think we can establish some standards for minimum acreage or percentage of parcel that must remain in active agriculture. I don't see a reason why not to allow someone to apply for a coastal development permit or use permit for the processing and the retail, et cetera, on that list, on that chart in ag lands.
If I may, through the chair, so I will just note that we do allow processing in ag lands with the coastal development use permit, and for the benefit of everyone, this is page 14 of 18 of the facilities ordinance that has the table on it. And so we do allow processing right now with the coastal development use permit, and we allow distribution. So just to be clear on what other uses you would like to see added to
So
that.
it'd be manufacturing, testing, and retail probably is most important. And I'm not sure what the micro business, I guess I have to go back and look at the definition.
And when you, pardon me, if you could clarify for staff, manufacturing level 1 or level 2 or both?
Well, what would normally be allowed on ag lands?
Actually, none within our inland zones at this time.
I'd say the non-volatile. I mean,
Non-volatile, okay.
I mean, ag lands generally don't really have a lot of neighbors. They're, fairly large parcels adjacent to other large parcels for the most part.
Supervisor McCowan?
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. Well,
He's looking back here.
using that rationale, there's a whole lot of things that we might allow in ag that that don't really further the intent of the ag zoning district. But I was actually looking at some of the other zones, such as rural village and commercial, and I was thinking we might allow more uses in those zones, given that it would require either a coastal development permit or a coastal development use permit. So for instance, rural village, I'm not sure why we wouldn't allow processing and commercial as well. And yeah, we want those areas to be used for other commercial and retail purposes, but do we never see a vacant storefront? So, I mean, I think there may be capacity to allow more uses in more locations, but I'll leave it to the coastal supervisors to weigh in.
If I may, through the chair.
Yes.
Julia Ackerkrog, Chief Planner, is just when we're talking about the use types here, I just want to be clear what we'll have to do. We'll take the direction received here today, but we do need to go back and look at what's allowed within each of these zoning districts to be sure that we can support this and justify these allowances to the California Coastal Commission, that they work within the existing framework of those zoning districts. So I just wanted to be clear that, we'll receive the direction from you today, but we do, as staff, need to ensure that we're actually going to be able to support those moving forward.
Okay, and what I need to do will be right there. We're still discussing. I'll go to Supervisor Williams and Supervisor Haschek.
I would support all uses in ag except manufacturing level 2 volatile.
Supervisor Haschek?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I would support the retail because I go back to what Supervisor Jurdy said about the wineries and having the wine tasting room, and I think that's totally appropriate to have it associated with the cannabis growing. But at the same time, I don't think that we should be getting into manufacturing in ag, because I think that we need to preserve as much ag land as possible.
Okay, so we have 5 supervisors, all coming from different directions. Supervisor Williams?
So on the coast, I imagine the grows will be larger in size for the most part because the focus is indoor, both because of the available land and zoning and also because of the climate conditions. And the small indoor growers on the coast are known for producing medicine, and their need is manufacturing. There's not a lot of industrial locations for them to process their medicine. On ag, I would see it as actually a way to preserve the open space, to preserve ag, because the manufacturing would be a very small footprint on a large ag parcel.
Supervisor Haschek, do you have a response back?
Well, I guess I'd like to see what staff says about that.
Okay. Can staff respond, please?
And just to be clear, we're speaking about processing on ag lands at this time. Is that correct? Or just all of the various use types?
We were talking about manufacturing level 1. is
Of
my
level 1.
understanding.
Yes.
Excuse me. So for us, I mean, for staff, there are quite a few requirements that you have to go through when you're doing development on ag lands in terms of required and supplemental findings under the coastal code as well. And a lot of that is speaking to that renewed and continued agricultural use is not feasible on that site. So I just want to be clear that even if we do allow it under this table here, there still are site-by-site specific findings that have to be made to demonstrate that you're not precluding that site from future agricultural use. And so I say this with assuming that the Coastal Commission will view this as a conversion of ag lands to non-agricultural uses. But honestly, I don't know if we're quite clear yet whether or not the Coastal Commission will consider this like an agricultural use and therefore not considered as conversion. I will say conversion from the Coastal Commission even includes if you're putting a single family on an agriculturally zoned property. And just acknowledging that we do need to go through that local coastal program certification. So I'm hesitant to say that yes or no definitively that would be appropriate. It really would be looking at it on a site-by-site specific case.
And
So.
actually, some of us are veterans, having gone through the Mendocino Town Plan and having 5 very strong sticking points, and we got 3, and they were able to stop us at 2 that they did not like. So, we can always test them. Supervisor Williams.
So I support staff's caution that it's only an attempt. And I'd still like to move forward with manufacturing level 1 in ag.
Supervisor Dirty.
So I recognize that the Coastal Commission has to approve it, but so long as we have a policy that does not allow the subdivision of the ag parcels for the use of cannabis, I think we can make a strong case that allowing for the diversification of revenue for existing farms on ag lands by allowing them to have this other revenue stream, this other activity, actually enables the ag activities to continue on into the future. So I think we have a strong argument to be made. And although I normally would only propose level 1 non-volatile, on the ag parcels, I don't know. Maybe that is the right place to allow the volatiles besides industrial. And the reason is because when we visited up in Humboldt, they were saying really the future of the market isn't in the non-volatiles. It's going to be they up in Arcata, and granted that's an industrial site or light industrial site. They were going with volatiles. I don't know if we want to limit it. Again, it is a request, and these are on parcels that should be at least 40 acres in size, because it's zoned ag land. So I think our request should include the volatiles because we're allowing it, I think, only in industrial properties elsewhere in the county.
Okay, supervisors, we need to get on the same page and be agreeing in order for this to go forward. Supervisor Williams?
I support Supervisor Jurdy's addition of manufacturing level 2 for ag.
Did you get that, clerk? Supervisor Haschek?
I would look at what comes back from staff, but I'm not leaning in that direction.
Well, I feel pretty much like Supervisor Haschek, but I think if staff research shows that level 1 would be an allowable use in ag, I would be able to support that. And then, maybe one way to approach this is, depending on what staff research is, they can simply present it to the Planning Commission as a what-if. And then we would get the benefit of the Planning Commission's recommendation on, yes, staff thinks it may be allowable. Does the Planning Commission recommend to us that that would be an appropriate use?
Okay, Supervisor Williams, are you
Yeah, so
willing to agree with that?
Not necessarily. When Supervisor Dirty and Planning Director Schultz and I went to Arcata, we saw a volatile facility, and it was smaller than a shipping container. It was 8 by 10, 8 by 12, fully enclosed, commercial, off the shelf. They just parked it there, and they were able, with blast containment, they were able to do their volatile processing. It looked like it would have very little impact. I can imagine that 8 by 10 foot on an 80-acre ag parcel having almost no impact, and yet this is an important tool for some of the medicine makers to do their extraction. And yet, if we require industrial, you can think of a lot of places on the coast, especially the South Coast, where there just isn't any industrial land available. And so I would like to ask staff to consider it, work through the process, and come back with a recommendation based on findings.
Or go to the Planning Commission?
Sure. Yes, agreed.
So Supervisor McCowan, Supervisor Hascheck. You want to do the test to the Planning Commission?
Yeah, I'm fine with that.
Thank you.
Supervisor
Madam-
McCowan?
Yes, Madam Chair, and then,
So
Su-
before we go on, did you get it down, clerk? Okay. Then let's do this, just so we get it right.
Let me tell you what I think I'd like to tell you what I think I have, and then you could
Okay.
correct me, because it's gone back and forth a little bit. In the chart of uses for ag, we're referring to ag only at this point, allow processing, manufacturing, non-volatile, manufacturing level 2, distributing and retail, but the manufacturing levels are based on Planning Commission recommendations and findings. Is that correct?
well, actually, processing and distribution are already included, and we were talking about adding the manufacturing level 1 and level 2 and retail.
So, okay. So you had it right.
Yeah.
But we also suggested level 1 and level 2, correct, Supervisor McCowan?
And
and
I think
adding-
retail.
She got that?
And adding retail?
Got that.
Okay,
But processing and distribution were already in there. Yeah.
okay.
For clarification, is there a reason why we wouldn't include testing or microbusiness? I mean, staff, any thoughts on that? If we were to allow the others?
Testing is a little challenging. We've had a hard time fitting that into analogous use types. So really, we've boiled it down. There's really a couple districts that would actually allow it if we look under existing use types that we have in terms of these various zoning districts. So I'd be happy to take a look at this again. But like I said in my comments prior, is that we will have to look at these recommendations and see what we can support here going forward.
Deputy County Counsel, through the chair, just to add on to that, I think microbusiness might well be fine to consider. That's tying something to what's happening on the property. The testing is a little weirder because that can't be something that a permittee otherwise owns. So it's kind of a separate, more industrial, heavy commercial use that isn't part of the ag operation. So that one, I think, would be probably a harder sell as opposed to looking at what we can reasonably say all ties together with the cultivation on site.
So
That's a good point.
So given that feedback from staff, would the board be okay with the microbusiness being added to the
Yes.
ag?
I would.
But not testing.
Yes.
Okay. Supervisor Williams?
Yes, I agree.
Okay, and you suggested.
Adding the microbusiness, yes.
Okay, so Supervisor McCowan?
Well, I do want to say, for the sake of the exercise, I'm going along with, let's look at retail dispensary, but I see that as being pretty different because that invites a lot of, potentially a lot of retail traffic. onto an ag parcel. I don't know how appropriate that really is. And another thing that we might consider, if staff finds, yeah, you might be able to allow manufacturing, et cetera, maybe it should be a product produced on that site.
Oh, that's usually how it does with ag.
Yeah, so if it's supposed to be related to they're growing things on that property, why aren't we having them use those products for
Well, they
their
have to. Except, I do believe that's a percentage, maybe. Could you explain how we have with traditional ag and ag zoning in relationship to all our discussion here and what is allowed? I mean, it's usually an auxiliary facility that processes what's grown on the land.
Typically it is, and I'll say for traditional ag and most of the county, other than the wine tasting rooms, that's the only one that's really had any sort of limitation on it. But you can qualify into a different use type if you are doing this for other folks. It becomes more like a storaging, distribution, warehousing type of activity. So you can transfer into another use type that may require a discretionary permit if you're doing that activity for other folks as well, beyond just your product produced on the site. So, and with what we have here, I believe it would be limited to just what the product is that's produced on the site. And I see Deputy County Counsel is just reviewing to ensure that I'm correct in that statement as well.
Deputy County Counsel Matthew Kudrowski, there's an existing exception for what we're calling home manufacturing. And that really is where it's a home occupation or cottage industry level amount of manufacturing on site. And that's for it'll be allowed in any zone where cultivation is allowed. And it is limited then to what you're cultivating on site. I know we went with that inland because that was the furthest we thought we could stretch our, we're working within our existing codes in the inland side without any kind of a major use permit program. We thought that was the most reasonable limits we could look to. So that's already built into the code is this allowance for non-volatile manufacturing on the same site as a cultivation site, but it's capped at certain limits. And here it would be either home manufacturing or cottage industry. And that's on page 7 of 18.
Supervisor Williams?
One of the takeaways from our visit to Arcata was they started with a comprehensive, detailed ordinance, and then over time they've backed away to a looser, at discretion, come into compliance over time. Because they didn't want to put businesses under before they could even get going. I have a worry about being too restrictive here. I like the idea of a focus of direct sales. It's what the farm is producing that's being sold. But you start looking at edibles, well, the sugar or sugar substitutes surely wasn't produced on site, right? So you said a percentage. Is that the percentage of THC, CBD, or is it the other ingredients that go into the edibles? I think we're getting too detailed. I think we should give staff a directive that the intent is to allow the ag farms to sell their product in whatever form with whatever additional materials they want to add to customers, with the hope that this could turn into a pennyroyal-like situation, that we have more visitors coming through because they can do a farm tour, see the cannabis, buy in the retail shop. But I don't see it as a dispensary on ag parcels, and I think we can leave it to staff to come up with the exact wording.
Do we have a response to Supervisor Williams, or shall we go to Supervisor Jurdy?
I agree with those comments. I mean, that's kind of what I had in mind was actually I was thinking the Pennyroyal example in Anderson Valley, where it's a destination that people are going to. Although I don't know if every bit of, probably I guess all the goat's milk comes from their site, but there's other things for sale there that are clearly not raised on site.
Okay.
Chair Brown, may I ask for clarification on one thing that was said earlier? Supervisor McCowan mentioned rural village back to the chart of uses to allow processing in commercial, and I didn't catch if there was a consensus on that.
There is from Williams.
for clarification, so rural village would be processing, what was the other?
Commercial.
Commercial.
Oh, just processing in commercial and in rural village? Yeah, sure.
Okay. That give you direction?
Thank you.
And we also need to go over that letter. And for the points.
I wonder, could we finish with this chart first, or are we?
Well, I thought maybe we are done, but
Well, the micro business, maybe a broad general direction, because I think on the inland, we wound up being fairly liberal with where we would allow that, because it's, you know, it's got to be somebody who's using their own product. So if we allow it in the inland in a zoning district, I would be in favor of allowing it in the coastal.
Agreed.
So staff could just review that.
okay, repeat yourself for the
So
clerk.
that micro business would be allowed in coastal zone, in the same coastal zoning districts as in the inland, in addition to what's shown here. Well, it's pretty limited here.
Okay.
So micro business, for example, if we allow it in rangeland, we would allow it here in rangeland.
So I've collected microbusiness allowed in the same coastal zoning district as in the inland, is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Agreed.
I think it's direction, full direction. Okay. All right. Supervisor McCowan, we need to move forward.
If everyone else is good with the chart, so am I.
Okay. But we still have a letter to go over at the suggestion of Supervisor Williams. Do you have something to say?
Deputy County Counsel Matthew Kudrowski, one small note on that, in terms of expectations of what that means. I think we're missing industrial and something else for the, on the microbusiness side. What we did in terms of the table, it wasn't allowed as a matter of right everywhere inland, but we did build it in, again, in the microbusiness use type language. If it's there in conjunction with another use, you can add on various uses tied to a cultivation site. So in terms of expectations, I'm not sure the table will change dramatically, and I think we did try and build in the same allowances, inland versus coastal. We'll double check that.
Well, that's the intent, however we get there.
Supervisor Haschek, did you?
Well, I was going to look at the letter, and I'm in agreement that we did deal with one of the points on the letter, and I think that we should recommend that letter to staff.
Second.
We have two supervisors in favor. And this is on Jude's letter. Supervisor Judy?
So I'm reading the letter, and what I'm not seeing from the letter is what are the zoning districts that it's referring to? Is it referring to commercial? Is it, so I'm just not clear what zoning districts this is. It's the commercial zoning district.
Well, in level one, it already allows for that in commercial by the staff table.
So maybe we could have staff go over the letter and talk about how these bullet points 2, 3, 4, 5 would relate to the proposal for the commercial zoning district.
So what I'm going to do is call for a break. So staff can, I'm not going to put them in a situation where they have to respond quickly, because they need to be very thoughtful with this, and thank you, Jude. So we're going to give staff 10 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes to go over it, and then they'll be prepared. So we are on break. We're back on. Okay. All right, we're back in session, and board members, I want to remind you, we still have more to do. So I want to wrap this up. And so on the letter and the points, staff, are you prepared to address each one of those?
Yes, we are.
Thank you.
So I believe one is a sort of moot point, as we established during the meeting here. So starting with number 2, shared facilities. And I will note that we do have an allowance for shared facilities written into the code here. So I really actually had more of a question of what is intended by this idea of fast tracking and what would be I guess a fast tracking of the permit. As we have it laid out right now, one person would be obtaining a coastal development permit for the entirety of the facility, and then up to 5 users could get cannabis facilities business licenses to operate within that same facility. So staff would just need a little bit clearer direction on exactly what fast tracking you're looking for.
Okay, at the discretion of the chair, and you only have 30 seconds. So please come forward and explain it quickly.
Thank you. 2 issues. One is it's important to not limit it to 5 users. We're trying to focus development in appropriate places. So if something's permitted appropriately, we should maximize the number of users. I don't understand why it's limited to 5. Second, in terms of fast tracking it, I think what Judy was referring to was trying to get this, if there's a piece of the ordinance that can be implemented before it goes through the coastal commission process. I think that's what she's talking about, is the need right now. And it may not be able to be fast-tracked and separated out, but to the extent it can be added into an existing use, that would be great.
I need your name.
Hannah Nelson.
Thank
Sorry.
you. And I'm seeing heads saying no, so please.
Yes, thank you. So I understand looking at not limiting it to 5. That's certainly something staff can look at in terms of the number of users that can occupy that facility. And then to the secondary point of fast tracking this in terms of the processing review timeline, I think that really it's going to be tied to the remainder of this ordinance. I'm not sure what pulling it out would really get us anywhere much quicker, because we don't have these allowances written into the coastal code at this time.
Okay, I have 2 supervisors that want to speak. You're very limited. So Supervisor McCowan, you were first.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't support piecemealing the ordinance. I don't support having a limit on the people who could use this facility once it's been properly permitted to a master user.
Supervisor Williams.
I agree. The goal here should be trying to pull cannabis manufacturing and cultivation out of the residential areas. Ag is a great place to put it, and so we shouldn't have an artificial limit. It should be based on what the parcel can support with some discretionary review.
Agree.
Okay, you've got a majority in direction.
Thank
Go
you.
forward.
On the third item on Ms. Tillman's letter is about distribution. And so with the distribution, we really tried to tie where distribution was permitted to analogous uses, which really tied to when they were considered conditional uses, therefore requiring the coastal development use permit, versus principally permitted uses, therefore requiring the coastal development permit. So in some of these districts, you see that it is a use permit primarily because that's where that use lies within that district in terms of what the intents are behind allowances in that particular zoning district. So it varies. If the board so wished, we could certainly look at whether or not it's possible to consider those as coastal development permits. I will say it's relatively similar processing between a coastal development permit or a coastal development use permit. It's typically 6 to 8 months in the process. The fees are very similar. So the real difference is the hearing body.
Okay. Go ahead, Supervisor.
Staff, do you have a recommendation?
I guess my recommendation would be to keep it as written within the table, but primarily because of that's the conditional uses that are allowed that we really tried to tie it to. So it really is keeping in line with the existing zoning districts.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Go forward.
Well,
So for number 4, this is about processing, which is talking about limiting it to trimming and packaging without the need for cultivation or retail activities in association with distribution. So I believe we've received direction already from you today regarding adding processing in the rural village and commercial zoning districts. This is the districts that also allow distribution. And so I believe that this will address most of those concerns if that is something that we move forward with. However, we can really look at whether or not if it's not going to work to have processing within the rural village and commercial district, looking if you want to have an allowance for distribution to have some ancillary activities to it. So sort of leaving that ball in your court there.
Should we consider GVMU and GHMU?
You certainly could. I will say those are very limited to like the downtown area of Gualala. So considering that most of those lots are about 12,000 square feet in size, and many are residential districts with some limited commercial activities on them.
Okay, Supervisor McCowan?
Well, again, given that there's limited
Talk to your microphone.
Thank you. Given that there's limited opportunities and there would be review, I could support looking at those areas for processing. But also, I think for all of the processing, I could support a coastal development permit rather than a use permit.
That was for all processing, if I understood correctly?
Yes. I just don't see what the big issues are with processing particularly. But
again, it was just that we've tied them to analogous uses, so it was what was either conditionally or principally permitted within those particular zoning districts.
Second on both points.
I have to look for a third. Supervisor Jurdy?
I could.
Supervisor Haschak?
Yes, I could go with that.
Okay.
And one more on the table, testing. I'm wondering why that couldn't be allowed in rural village or commercial.
Again, staff, we can look at that. So we will be looking at that back at the office and comparing with the use types and such. But so just if I could just back up a moment though and just clarify then. So that was changing processing to a coastal development permit within all zoning districts, as well as adding Gualala Village mixed use and Gualala Highway mixed use as allowance for doing processing within those districts. Is that correct?
Affirmative.
Correct, in all for which we've recommended that use.
Okay.
Supervisor Williams, you agree?
I agree.
Okay. Righty?
And then again, with the test.
Hang on. Yes, clerk.
That was just what I was going to ask for clarification on. He had mentioned testing earlier.
Okay, so, all right. So which is which?
In terms of,
Supervisor McCowan had recommended that we also add testing to rural village commercial, and I just wanted to confirm we had consensus on that.
Yes.
Yes.
and then also for all of the testing, I would suggest a coastal development permit. Currently, we require a use permit in the Gualala zones.
So that's another.
Yes.
The 5th District, Supervisor Haschak.
I guess my question would be, why is it use permit in Gualala for those two zones?
It really is just the comparison of the analogous uses that these fell under conditional uses within those zoning districts. Principally permitted uses in those districts really are more residential in nature, and more commercial activities fall under conditional uses subject to a use permit.
Now, I don't want to go backwards, but you had one more thing under distribution, or did you not?
I think we had covered that, perhaps.
Well, I think you were trying to make another point.
No,
Okay.
I'm okay with how distribution is.
So may I confirm that the coastal development permit for testing in all zones was also a consensus?
Yes.
I don't know that we had
Okay.
that yet
Oh, I thought we did.
for testing.
For testing?
You did distribution.
If
Well,
I
this-
may, through the chair, I can tell you what I believe my understanding is here, which is that all the processing would be allowed in all the districts subject to a
Right.
coastal development permit under testing that we had under rural, village, and commercial, that those would be allowed with a coastal development permit. And additionally, to swap that Gualala Village mixed use and Gualala Highway mixed use would be a coastal development permit as opposed to a coastal development use permit.
Okay, you have that? Okay. Julia, you're going to help the clerk with that clarification.
I promise I
And
will.
that's the way I understood. Supervisor Jurdy.
So during the break, I had a chance to talk with staff about the cultivation ordinance, and I just want to make sure we go back to one item there before we end the day.
Okay, so you have that one marked? Okay. So we're moving on, I believe, to 5 now?
Correct, yes. So number 5 is really talking about loosening the restrictions or the restrictive language pertaining to micro businesses in commercial zones. So it's really, the way the language was designed was really to ensure that that principal use was the storefront use of the retail business there. So, staff is open to direction here from the board.
I'm looking at Supervisor Jurdy on the micro business and commercial
Yeah.
zones. The rationale of tying all the activities to retail as a primary use.
No.
Okay, I need to hear. We need to go.
I think that-
Supervisor McCowan.
Well, I would support having the Planning Commission review the options on that one.
I would support that.
Okay.
Sure.
All right.
Thank
Direction
you. Understood.
on-
Understood. Thank you.
Okay. Number
I don't believe we need to address number 6. We
no.
got a kudos,
I
though.
think we
so.
got through that one. I was just looking at it. All right. So we have one more item, Supervisor Jurdy, and this is on the cultivation
Yeah, so
ordinance.
So if we go back to table 1, and I would ask Jesse Davis to reiterate what we discussed during the break. But really, if you look at table 1, I believe when you look at, it's only, for the most part, it's only going to be the rural residential, the RR, that's going to be affected by the smaller parcel sizes. The other zoning districts are going to be on generally on much larger parcels. But I think what we were discussing was swapping out the 2-acre minimum with 3.5 acres, but using the footnote below that it's 3.5 acres so long as it is adjacent to a 5-acre. 50% of the parcels are 5 acres or more. Otherwise, it would be 5-acre minimum. So upping the minimum size, but creating an allowance for a smaller parcel if it's adjacent to larger parcels. So maybe Jesse could explain how that would work.
If I may, through the chair, Jesse
Yes,
Davis.
sir.
Supervisor Jurdy and I did discuss the minimum acreage associated with cottage cultivations in size. This also relates to Supervisor Williams' comment with regards to sort of identifying neighborhoods and finding a way to essentially define those in a way that doesn't convolute the ordinance. Using acreage as a sort of tool for that is an effective way because we don't apply additional recommendations or zoning, but effectively we do eliminate the cultivation possibilities in neighborhoods that are typically 2 acres or less in size. That being said, the ability for an applicant to expand their cultivation size would only be allowed to a type 1 if they are surrounded by those or share their boundaries with parcels of 5 acres in size or larger. So essentially what my understanding of our conversation would be that the minimum acreage is raised for cottage permits to a 3.5, as well as, again, pointing out that individuals who have boundaries or shared boundaries 50% or greater with parcels of 5 acres in size or larger would be allowed to potentially still expand. So we essentially constrain cultivation to minimum parcel sizes of 3.5 acres.
So, do you have questions of staff? Supervisor Haschak?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. So are there RR5s that have 3.5 acre parcels and other non-conforming parcels?
There, most definitely. Across the
Okay.
county, you would find, pardon me, Jesse Davis, Senior Planner. You'll find that rural residential is perhaps our most inconsistent zoning designation with regards to the acreages assigned to those zoning designations. Often what we found on the inland side of our county was that those parcels that have a designation of perhaps, say, RR1 were identified for subdivision years ago. However, for topographical reasons and other developmental constraints, they were never developed for cultivation. However, are developed for residential use. So as a result, you have just inconsistent parcels with RR1s with 20 acres, RR5s with 1.5 acres. It's, again, our most inconsistent. That being said, using acreage as a tool to establish the minimum would allow us to raise that bar and protect neighborhood areas that are under, for the most part, 2 acres in size. So this would be a way to address both of those without adding additional sort of regulations to the ordinance.
If I could just follow that up.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So what if we did the 3.5 minimum, but it also had to be an RR5?
Again, I think that we want to try to remove the complexity of the zoning designation to this table. The zoning designations RR1, RR2, RR5, RR10 perhaps prove to be one of the most confounding sort of aspects of our zoning regulations on the inland side. Again, going to an acreage-based system would allow us to establish a very clean minimum that doesn't look at the zoning designation as much as it does the acreage itself. Acreage being a defining characteristic of a neighborhood.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about those areas like Mitchell Creek where there are some, lots of 2s, but then there are 5s right around that area too, so.
If I may, through the chair, again, that's what we're trying to address here, is that we're removing the zoning designation aspect and fully looking at the acreage aspect rather than the RR5, RR10. And this is really looking, again, to establish acreage as the tool to evaluate these cultivation sites at the offset.
Supervisor McCowan? Oh,
If
I'm
I may,
sorry.
through the chair,
Yes.
thank you. So I just want to clarify here, and I think just to make sure, we would need to make a few changes to the table here, as well as amending the footnotes for this discussion that we're having here. But I just want to make sure I'm understanding the intent behind Supervisor Jurdy's request here. So essentially what we'd be doing would be changing the minimum parcel area for the small outdoor, that's the type C, the type CA, and the type CB, to a 5-acre minimum, acknowledging that if you are 3.5 acres or larger and share more than 50% of your parcel boundaries with parcels 5 acres or larger, that you then can cultivate in those. Is that what I'm understanding?
That's what that's why I thought Jesse said during the break. Maybe that wasn't exactly what he said, but
Okay.
that's why I was.
Okay, because I think we were talking about adding 3.5 acres in the top of the table, which I think actually we want to set the base as 5 acres and give an exception if you're 3.5 acres in size and that you share 50% of your parcel boundaries. So what this will result in then is that we change the minimum parcel area for those various districts to a 5-acre minimum requirement, and then we would need to amend section D1 below the table to speak to that allowance for sites that are less than 5 acres in size, 3.5 acres, and share more than 50% of their parcel boundaries, that they would be allowed to do those cottage types of activities. What this would also then mean that we need to look at is our present footnote that we have there would allow for, if you're 3.5 acres or larger, it allows you to move up to a type 1 and 1B. So I don't know if the board has any discussion about that and wanting to make any changes to that section as well. So.
Oh, gosh. Okay, I'm going to give just about 5 more minutes because we've got to get back to our public hearing on the master fee schedule. And so Supervisor McCowan?
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. Well, I thought that D1 already allows parcels, non-conforming parcels of 3.5 acres to scale up to 1A, 1B, correct?
It does, so it would be amending this to add C, CA, and CB as the use types that you could scale to as well.
Those could also scale
qualify
up
for.
to the 5,000 if they had 3.5 acres and the other condition was met?
That's essentially what the question I was posing to you is if there's any other changes you wish to see made if we're changing sort of this base
And
acreage
then,
minimum.
where we have minimum parcel area where it currently reads 2 for C, CA, CB, that'd go to 3.5.
That would actually go to 5, and then the exception is listed in D1. So if you're not 5
Everything would
acres.
be a minimum of 5.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure how appropriate that is for a small indoor artificial light. So I don't know.
The exception would allow you then, if you're 3.5 acres or larger and you share the 50% of your parcel boundaries with parcels that are 5 acres or larger, that you could still conduct those activities. So effectively, it would be reducing the minimum so from the table, it would be increasing the minimum parcel size to 3.5 acres, provided that you can demonstrate that you have 5 acres surrounding you on at least 50% of your parcel boundaries. So effectively, it will be making it a little bit less or more restrictive in terms of what qualifies beyond the 2-acre minimum that's currently written in there.
I think there's more implications to this than we'll resolve in 5 minutes. It's another one I'd recommend we let the Planning Commission chew on it and see what they say.
We will certainly make a point to bring this up as a discussion point with the Planning Commission then to ensure that that discussion happens.
I'd prefer we leave the original language. I don't see a rational basis for moving to 5 acres on 50% of the boundary. If the issue is really the smell, the 50% large parcels on one side doesn't prevent cultivation right up against a smaller parcel. If what we're really worried about is odor, we should have a setback, or we should have an odor requirement, parts per million, or something that's rational, right? Not just look at the parcel size, because you could have a long, skinny parcel that's 6 acres, that no matter where they cultivate, neighbors can smell it. And so this is only giving us an approximation. We're going to run into a lot of edge cases where neighbors are unhappy. I would rather endorse Supervisor McCowan's idea of giving this to the Planning Commission to come back with a more thought out proposal.
Okay, so this is what I'm hearing. We're going to give it to the Planning Commission to discuss and make that recommendation. You all agree with that?
Yes.
Okay.
I just hope they bring back my recommendation.
So, Carla, you have that? Okay, one more. Supervisor McCowan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I did have one more point. So the first paragraph of the cultivation ordinance, it states excluding the town of Mendocino, and I think the intent there is that we're not allowing commercial cannabis cultivation within the Mendocino town plan boundaries. Accurate?
That is correct.
And then, so to me, that wasn't instantly obvious. I've given staff some potential language that clarifies that point. They could consider it as they wish.
It's okay, hang on.
The next ordinance, in the second paragraph, we see the phrase, except that, this all applies in the coastal zone, except for areas subject to Title 20, Division 3, Mendocino Town Zoning Code. So what's the intent of that, that none of these facilities are allowed in the town of Mendocino?
The town of Mendocino is its own separate zoning code and town plan. And so we, at this point, have solely been focusing on Division 2, which is the bulk of the coastal zone, excluding town of Mendocino. What there is right now is that you may be aware there are currently dispensaries operating within the town of Mendocino, and we've been able to allow those as essentially continuance of an existing retail use in those areas. We do not have intentions at this time to come forward under this ordinance to amend the Mendocino town plan or zoning code.
And so those dispensaries could continue, and presumably a new one could apply on the same basis that the existing ones did? It's a retail operation.
Presumably, yes, but we'd always like to take a look.
Thank you.
Okay, I have a problem as chair with you giving language to staff that we haven't all seen. It was clear to me about the town of Mendocino. So I'm going to ask my colleagues Do you want to consider that
I
as a
can
board
read it
as
to
the
you
whole?
if you want, but it's,
Well, it probably should have been handed out to us. So I'm not quite sure. If you'd like to go ahead, read it into the record, please do so as quickly as possible.
certainly. So instead of excluding the town of Mendocino in the body of the paragraph, I would strike it there, and I would add at the end of that sentence, excluding the town of Mendocino where cannabis cultivation is excluded. And again, I think
Excluding
staff
as
can
excluded.
decide if one is better than the other, but it supports the intent of what staff is doing. It's a non-substantive change.
But that's not the point, Supervisor. The point is it has to come before this body to be discussed. No one supervisor should be handing it in.
You've
I
never-
will not debate with you, but that's the way
I'll just
procedure
observe,
is.
you've never made a suggestion to staff.
Not like that, sir. Believe me. Matt?
Deputy County Counsel Matthew Kudrowski, the only intent behind the language that's in the draft ordinances is really just to reaffirm the fact that Division 2 doesn't apply to the town of Mendocino. So if we want to we can make some clarifying changes to make that clear. We didn't want to say nothing of the town of Mendocino and have anyone assume that this applied there. The town of Mendocino is Division 3 of the zoning code, and for the moment, we're just looking at the dispensaries that have been allowed there as is. We can always come back later with more direction. So that's the reason for the language. It's just to say it doesn't apply there because this whole division doesn't apply there.
Sure. And I actually understood that. Supervisor Haschak?
Yes, that's how I read it too. And when it says land use regulations for the coastal zone, excluding the town of Mendocino, I understand what it's saying.
I did as well. Supervisor Williams?
No opinion. I didn't have my pen up.
Oh, okay. Supervisor Jurdy?
I don't really want to weigh in Mendocino right now.
Okay. Well, I like the language as presented. I think Supervisor Haschak said that as well. So we have two that aren't weighing in, and we have one that is suggesting different language. I need somebody to help me on this. Supervisor McCowan?
Madam Chair, my suggestion was staff can consider it and do as they believe appropriate. If they like their original language, they will stick with it. I mean, it's not a big deal either way.
Okay.
I think we've clarified the intent abundantly.
Did you have more comment?
Deputy County Counsel Matthew Kudrowski, I can see the language excluding the town of Mendocino where cannabis may be cultivated could be read in a different way. So I will take that under advisement and we'll see if we come back with some slightly revised language to make it clear what we were going for in the first place.
Okay. That sounds good, because we were kind of at a standoff. All righty. So this item was to give staff direction. I believe you have direction now, even though it was difficult getting through all of that, and I want to thank you. And we're going to go back to, so you can't leave, we're going to go back to the public hearing.